So now, as we look at tonight, you can tell that Steve Marino was a high school history teacher for 35 years. You've seen his biography. We are very, very fortunate to have him on the board. He's on the board. He's a certified tour guide at Fort Adams extraordinaire. And if you haven't had his tour, make sure to go out and ask when he's going to be on duty and go out and take his tour of Fort Adams. It really is that good. There you go. He holds degrees from Williams College, from Brown, from the Hartford Seminary, and I will let him tell you what he's going to talk about tonight. It's great to have you with us, Steve. Thanks.
Can everybody hear me? I had to switch. Okay, perfect. Thank you, Mike, and thank all of you for coming tonight. It's always a pleasure to be here, but it's a real honor to be here during Irish Heritage Month. That's very special to me. And I also want to thank one other person while I'm at it. My wife is hiding back there. And whatever you think of this talk, okay, it was way worse before she got to it. She has helped me immeasurably, and she had to listen to this way more than anybody deserves. Okay, so thank you, my bride over there. You know, since the last time we were here, I've had the privilege and pleasure of working with Professor John Quinn, who's also hiding in the back, of South Virginia University. He has actually taken me under his wing and taken me off the island to these three research archives. The first one was the National Archives in Waltham, Massachusetts, and there they have a treasure trove of original documents about the building of Fort Adams. And one of them was court papers of this case, the United States versus McCarty versus Crowley, and we're going to talk about that tonight in a few minutes. He also took me to the archives of the Archdiocese of Boston in Braintree, Massachusetts. And they have sacramental records of confirmations and baptisms from 1827 to 1841. And we're going to be talking about those tonight too. And then a little closer to home, he took me to the archives of the Diocese of Providence. And there we were hosted by Father Robert Heyman, who was so gracious to us. And we found articles from the Boston Pilot. Now, if you're not familiar with the Boston Pilot, it was a Catholic newspaper started by the bishop in Boston. It was first published in 1829. And because so many Catholics at that time were Irish immigrants, the Boston Pilot became a chronicle of the Irish Catholic immigrant experience in the United States. And what I liked about these is all of these documents that we found in these archives shed light on this phenomenon that I showed you last time I was here. These are lists of individuals who have letters waiting for them at the Newport post office, okay? And they aren't being picked up. And from time to time, the post office had to publish these lists in local newspapers. In the 1836 list, you can see it, has a separate category for Irish, with Irish names listed underneath it, which suggests that the Irish community in 1836, they were here in Newport, but they were separate. They were distinct. They were the other, physically and culturally. In 1846, the names are integrated in the alphabetical list. So you see the Murphys and the O'Connors and the Sweeties and the Flanagans, they're integrated right with the other citizens. Why? What happened? What changed the perception between 1836 and 1846? That's what I wanted to do tonight. I wanted to take a deep dive and see if we could figure out why there was a change. The other thing these documents do, and this is why I love them, is they yield names of individuals who were here in Newport in this earliest time of the Newport Irish community. Hundreds of names. And when you start to research these names, suddenly you get another depth of understanding and a richer texture, and you shine a brighter light on this 10-year period. And I'll give you an example. One of the names we found in that first document was a woman named Catherine Connors. Catherine Connors came to Newport on a Thursday in October in 1836. And like so many Irish immigrants at that time, she had lost track of one of her loved ones, her husband, Dennis Connors. She comes to Newport, she can't find him, and so Thursday night, she stays at the boarding house of Patrick Pendergast. On Friday, she searches all over town, can't find any sign of her husband, and somebody suggests, obviously, you should go out to Fort Adams on Saturday, tomorrow, and you could probably find him there if he's in town. So she goes out, and she has an in. Her niece is married to a Thomas Finney. And so when she goes out to Fort Adams, she walks out there, she looks for Finney, can't find him. Looks for her niece, can't find him. And she can't find her husband. So she runs in, she tries to find Patrick Hart, an acquaintance. Can't find him. So she decides, okay, I give up. I'm going to walk back to Newport. Saturday afternoon, Saturday evening. On her way home, she runs into someone she's only met once before, a guy named John McCarty. Now, John McCarty runs one of the boarding houses out at Fort Adams, okay, that houses the laborers. He convinces her to come back to the boarding house, meet his wife, stay overnight. She'll have a better chance of finding her husband on Sunday. So she does. She goes back with him, yeah. When she gets there, she meets Mrs. McCarty. Mrs. McCarty's making supper for the boarders. She and Mrs. Connors feed the boarders. And then Mrs. McCarty says, I'm feeling lousy. I'm going to go lie down. Will you watch the bread that's baking in the stove, in the kitchen? No problem, says Catherine Connors. And we leave Catherine Connors in the kitchen of McCarty's boarding house, and a horrible, horrible crime was committed that night. The next morning, a group of children report that they found something in the haystack that's not moving. They go back and tell their parents. The parents go to investigate, and they find Catherine Connors alive, barely bruised and abused. And she's immediately taken to another boarding house run by James and Henrietta Kelly. It takes her a week to recover from her injuries. And as soon as she recovers, she walks back to Newport and immediately files a complaint with the local authorities and says that she's been raped out of Fort Adams. Now, because that case happened, that crime happened on United States federal property, okay, owned by the United States Army, the case was referred to the United States District Court up in Providence. Immediately subpoenas were issued, and they wanted to gather witnesses to testify under oath as to what happened. And the witnesses were ordered to go to the Newport jail. This is it, right on Marlborough Street. And they were supposed to go to the Newport jail and testify. And this is a list of the people that were called to testify. Now, if you look at this list and you read the testimony, there's couples. James and Henrietta Kelly ran a boarding house. Mary and William Mansfield ran a boarding house. The O'Connells, the Gibbonses, they ran the boarding houses. Tobin, he ran a boarding house, and so did John Murphy. The other people that were listed, Sullivan, Driscoll, Green, Carey, Smith, and Francis Murphy, they were in the kitchen that night. They were in the kitchen that night with Mrs. Connors. Now, I mentioned Mr. Kearney and Father John Corey because they were there that night. They were at Fort Adams that Saturday night. They were mentioned but never called as witnesses. Now what you get, I don't need you to look at this. This is amazing. I actually held this in my hand. It's 8 pages long, the witness testimony. It looks like this. It's all written by one person in the same handwriting. It's very clear. And this is Mary Mansfield. I'm going to read it to you. Mary Mansfield heard the woman scream on Saturday night before last. Sunday morning, her child told her that a woman was lying under the haystack. She asked Mr. Kearney to go with her to the woman. Her husband's testimony starts like this. William Mansfield went to bed a week from last Saturday and slept until about 12 o'clock. He heard a noise and opened the window. And it goes on. This testimony leads to the indictment against John McCarty and James M. Crowley for the rape committed at Fort Adams on Catherine Connors. There's more to the story. But not only does it lead to the indictment of these two individuals, it also gives us and me an on-the-ground eyewitness accounts of what it was like to be at Fort Adams as an Irish immigrant and laborer in 1836. The details in this testimony are amazing. And one of the things it does is it shows that Fort Adams was largely just a construction site. It was not a United States Army facility as yet. And there were hundreds of laborers living out there in boarding houses on the United States property. And the actual testimony describes the physical geography and the material culture of the Irish community out there at Fort Adams. For instance, it describes the boarding houses as duplexes. Two of them share the same wall and the same roof. It talks about the physical distance between the three boarding houses and the haystack. It talks about a rail fence around the haystack. Walter Tobin, one of the witnesses, said that that night he got a horse from the stable, went to Newport, picked up Father Corey, and brought him back because there was somebody sick at the Tobin boarding house. The details about one of the women was surprised to see Catherine Connors without a bonnet on. They described the quilt. And they also have a description, because so many of them were in the kitchen. They talk about gambling. There was card playing. There was a quart of rum consumed that night in the kitchen. And they were playing cards not for money. They were playing cards for rum. And somebody loses and has to go out and get more rum and bring it back. And all of these details give us such an on-the-ground view, but it's only a snapshot. It's only a weekend, a Saturday night out there. And in order to get some context about that community out in Fort Adams, I'm going to start the story back in 1835, the year before. In 1835, before I go there, the thing that struck me about this whole testimony, to be perfectly honest, Catherine Connors spent a week out there mending at that Kelly boarding house. A whole week. Not once did an Army officer appear at the construction site. Not once was an Army officer called. Never once was an Army officer called as a witness. The Army is just devoid of anything in this whole testimony or that week following the crime. And I realized, and this surprised me. I've been doing this for a long time, and it really surprised me. And I realized that probably the engineers who lived in town, they didn't live out there. Colonel Totten, the great, Army engineer, he didn't live out there. He lived in town with his family. They went and supervised the work. They did not supervise the boarding houses. And I think that's important for our story. The Newport Mercury in 1835, this is where I want to start, they reported that Congress failed to appropriate money for Fort Adams in 1835. Okay? And they also report several hundred Irish laborers will now be compelled to seek elsewhere for employment. We're going to lay the whole bunch off. It wasn't as bad as the Mercury reported. There was some leftover money from the previous year's appropriation, and they used that money to keep the fort as a token labor force, keep it going. The boarding houses stayed open, and in 1836, they resumed the appropriations. Now, a lot of laborers did leave. They had no choice. And if you thought that was bad, in 1837, the other shoe drops. The whole American economy goes into the tank. There's a collapse of the American economy, and it was started out with bank failures. People ran to the bank to get their money. It wasn't there. No credit, shortage of money, massive business failures, and unemployment that you couldn't believe. And this lasted for 4 years. Okay, I love these cartoons. You don't need to know how to read to get these cartoons. Here's your laborer. He's looking miserable. His tools are on the floor. Useless. His plate is empty. Yeah, and how miserable do these guys look? And the rent collector's at the door. And what's wonderful about this is a political cartoon, so you got to blame somebody for this, right? If you look back here, there's two portraits on the wall. See that? And they're the heroes of this labor, faded heroes. That's Andrew Jackson and Martin Van Buren. Martin Van Buren does not last long. He gets elected in 1846, one-term president. He gets blamed for all of this. Now, what does this have to do? What effect did this have on our Irish laborers out at Fort Adams? Two things. Number one, the appropriations get smaller and smaller and smaller. Congress just doesn't have the money to spend on building forts. Number two, their wages go down. Okay, because there's massive unemployment, there's surplus of labor, and so their wages go down. If you think that's bad, there's more bad news. The next year, Colonel Totten, the Dean of American Army Engineers, the guy who has been shepherding the building of Fort Adams for 12 years, the guy who makes sure that there's appropriations and that most of the money goes to Fort Adams, the crown jewel of American coastal fortifications, he leaves. He gets promoted. And he gets promoted to be the chief engineer of the United States Army. And he's replaced by a second lieutenant, James Mason. Mason's smart, he's capable, but he ain't no Joseph Totten. Okay? And everybody, from the people in town to the people out at the fort, they realize the employment picture out of Fort Adams is declining. Okay? Now, this is all reflected in the 1840 United States Census. This is the 1840 United States Census. This is the last entry. Census taker is the last place he went, was out to Fort Adams, and I'm going to blow this up for you. That says Lieutenant James L. Mason, Superintending Engineer, Fort Adams. And there's 149 laborers out there and 6 women. That's like a 22-to-1 ratio. It's unsustainable. It's also reflected in the same year, Newport had a housing survey. Now, this is not a census, okay? This is a counting of how many dwellings there were in Newport. And they list the owners of the dwellings over here and the head of households over here, okay? And they count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 dwellings out there. Those are the boarding houses. Okay, one of them is unoccupied, which makes sense because we're not operating at peak capacity. If you take this and you combine it with this, you got 149 male laborers living in 5 boarding houses, 30 laborers to a boarding house. And you're really starting to get some details as to what's going on at the fort. But the axe falls. I think it's bad now. The axe falls the next year. Because the next year, General Winfield Scott, the commander of the entire United States Army, decides, you know what? Fort Adams has done enough. We're going to send the soldiers and the cannons in. It might not be completely complete, but it's done, it's finished enough to man it with a garrison. Once again, the Newport Mercury reports 2 companies at Fort Adams in this harbor under the command of a major. Fort Adams will be completed for the troops to occupy in 2 or 3 weeks. 1841, marks the end of this place being a construction site. It becomes something different in August of 1841. Now, we know a lot about this first garrison because before the Civil War, you had to file this report. Every single military post in the United States had to file this report every month. This is the very first report from Fort Adams in August of 1841. This side was the commissioned officers, the other side was the enlisted personnel. I want to show you this. Here are the 6 of the first officers to be assigned to Fort Adams. And this is kind of Army humor, I hope. The very first commanding officer at Fort Adams was a Major Payne. And his second in command was a Captain Loud. You can't make this up. But I thought that was funny. But then I started looking at these guys, the first lieutenants and the second lieutenants. And this guy, I thought, H.J. Hunt. That's H.J. Hunt. Okay? He did not graduate first in his class at West Point. Far from it. Far from it. He was an artilleryman. And he becomes one of the big heroes at the Battle of Gettysburg. And guess what he did? He commanded the Union artillery on that 3rd day. Okay? This guy's a warrior. All right? He wanted to learn how to fire cannons. And fire them, he did at Fort Adams. And I wanted to tell you this because once you start firing cannons, it goes from a construction site to a military post. And the officers aren't sitting around somewhere in Newport supervising the construction. They're there. They are there. And they're firing guns and they're training troops and they're conducting military exercises and they're defending Narragansett Bay. So it starts immediately. And instead of hundreds of laborers, there's a garrison of about 100 to 200 soldiers. What does that mean? That's what it means. You can't have kids playing around haystacks when you're firing cannons and conducting military exercises and having mock battles. The era of the Newport Irish community at Fort Adams ends. It ends. That's only one half of the story. The other half of the story is while the employment picture at Fort Adams declines, something else is going on in Newport. Okay? Now, in order to tell that story, I'm going to use this unbelievable map. Now, if you don't remember anything I tell you tonight, and you just are going blank right now, don't forget this. I got this from the Library of Congress, loc.gov. It's really easy. You just type in map of Newport. If you've ever lived in Newport, if you're interested in Newport history, if you love maps, I'm a map geek. You're going to love this map. You can zero in on different parts of it, and it stays as clear as a bell. It is just awesome. You'll have so much fun with it. It's not just Newport. It's the entire Quinnipiac Avenue, Tiverton and Little Compton, all of Jamestown, New Shoreham, Block Island, and then they have little street food. It's almost like Google Earth. They have street views. Look at this. They get you right down onto the streets. And then there's an inset map of downtown Newport. It's amazing. We could go on and on and on. But I want to show you some highlights. First of all, I want to show you, I'm not lying, it's 1850. Okay? It's an 1850 map. Look at that. Look at that. You're standing right at the top of Memorial Boulevard. There's the spiced pear. Right? There's the entrance to the Cliff Walk right there. You're there in 1850. Look at that. Washington Square. All right? They call it the State House. We call it the Colony House. You're there. You're on the ground in 1850. The other thing I wanted to show you is this. This shows you Fort Adams. Fort Adams, the crown work is done, the redoubt is there, the fort's all done, and there's stables. There's no boarding houses. They're gone. They're gone. That's Narragansett Avenue. Nobody lives on Narragansett Avenue. The only person who lives on Dixon Street is Dixon. There's no 40 steps. There's no Cliff Walk. There's no Ocean Drive. There's the only thing south of Narragansett Avenue. In 1850, 12 farmhouses. That's it. That's it. Even north of Narragansett Avenue, there's nothing. Newport ends on Holland Street. Okay, this is very important to understand if you're going to understand the Irish at this time. I'm going to use this map. I want to show you a couple of things. I'm going to concentrate on these 4 buildings. That's the Coddington Mill. It opened in 1837. That's the Newport Steam Mill, opened in 1831. That is the Williams Woolen Mill. We're all familiar with Perry Mill. All these mills opened in the 1830s, most of them after the layoffs of 1835. So while the employment opportunities at Fort Adams were decreasing, the employment opportunities in Newport were increasing. Right? There's more. In 1840, oh, there's the Perry Mill. You're familiar with that? You're familiar with the the Newport Steam Mill. That's back here. And I wanted to show you this. There's nothing left of the Williams Woolen Mill except one building. And there it is. It was the tenement for the laborers. And originally, when it was built, there was no retail space on the bottom. In 1836, that's what a tenement looks like. And so I imagine that that's what the tenements look like out at Fort Adams. Something pretty similar to that. And I love this because it's still there. Now, I took this picture and I wanted to show you where it was. It's right at the foot of Denison Street. And when you walk down Thames Street next time, you can take a peek. This is where the laborers lived that worked in the mill behind it. But there's another aspect of this that's very important. The mills opened in the 1830s, and in 1840, the hotels start to arrive. And the Ocean House, which is right in the Stop and Shop parking lot, right? That opens in 1840. And then the Atlantic House, you know where the Elks Lodge is at the top of Pelham Street? That's where the Ocean House was. And then there was another big hotel in 1848 that opened, the Bellevue Hotel. And it was on Bellevue Street. Now we call it Catherine Street. I don't know when it changed, but it was called Bellevue Street back in 1850. And if you look at the buildings, these are by far the biggest buildings in Newport. And it's this tourist industry. And I'll give you an example of how popular it was. This is the Ocean House right next door in 1840. This is the Ocean House in 1850. They just keep adding on to it. All right? Because more and more visitors come. It's huge. That's the Atlantic House on the top of Pelham. And I couldn't find a photograph or a picture or a sketch of the Bellevue Hotel. But all of these employment opportunities in the 1830s and the 1840s are happening as the employment opportunities at Fort Adams are declining. And the other thing I want to say about this is the textile industry and the tourist industry is different than the construction that was going on at Fort Adams in a very fundamental way, and I really haven't completely figured this out. Women, children, and men worked in the mills and the hotels. At Fort Adams, it was 20 to 1. In town, this is a totally different pattern of employment. It's way more diversified. Fort Adams, there are a lot of single men. In town, it was a much different community. Got to do some more work on that. Okay, I'm not fully, I just kind of figured it out myself. The other thing about this new look, okay, is the narrative that I learned at Fort Adams when I first started being a tour guide we used to say it, the people who built Fort Adams, when that was finished, moved to Newport, worked in the mills, in the hotels, built St. Mary's, and their sons and grandsons built the mansions. You know how excited I was when I found that out? And then I found out the names of the people who were here, right? Who built the fort from those baptismal and confirmation records. So I got really excited. I am going to find their descendants living in Newport, right? And I am going to get all these artifacts, diaries, and stories, and my tours in Fort Adams are going to be so much better, and I'll get more tips, and everything is going to get better. And so I got my spreadsheet. And I made a beautiful Excel spreadsheet with all the names, hundreds and hundreds of names. And then I got the 1840 census. They weren't there. So I said, okay, wait a second. Maybe they were still at the boarding house in 1840, okay? So I got the 1850 census. I had a handful of them. I had hundreds of names. I got like 5. Uh-oh. Then I got desperate. I started looking in the Newport Mercury. And I started looking in the Newport Daily News. And I searched for names. Couldn't find them. And then there's 2 copies, I think, of the 1856 city directory. It lists everybody in Newport and where they lived. It's awesome. One's at the Redwood Library, and the other one's at the Historical Society. So I went down to the Historical Society, and I got a hold of it, and I got my spreadsheet out. I couldn't find it. And then one day at the library, I met Patrick Murphy. I said, Pat, you help me. And I said, what are you working on? And he goes, I'm working on getting a list of everybody who was buried at St. Mary's Cemetery over on Warner Street, which is the second Catholic cemetery. And I said, oh, you really have a list? And he said, yeah, I got a list. And it's almost alphabetical. And I said, oh, can I? He said, yes. So I got my spreadsheet out. And then I looked at the cemetery records that Pat gave me. They weren't there. The evidence was not matching the narrative. And then I got on Ancestry.com and I started to make family trees for these folks. And you know what? I found them. Everywhere. Not here. They left. I found Cornelius Sullivan owning hundreds of acres of a farm in Michigan. I just talked to, this week, one of John Farrell's descendants. And she sent me an email and she said, my, ancestor had 3 children. In 1830, they had a child in Newport. In 1832, they had a child in Newport. In 1834, they had a child in Newport. And then they took off to Iowa. And I said, I think I know why. And I said, and I also think I have the baptismal record for that first kid in 1830. And I did. That was cool. That was fun. James Dunn. He ends up in Iowa, but he doesn't go directly there. He leaves here, goes to upstate New York and has a child. He goes to Canada and has a child. He goes to Ohio, Pennsylvania and has a child. And then he ends up in Iowa. Daniel Murphy is born at Fort Adams. He's born in one of the boarding houses, and he ends up in Maine. And there's a descendant, not of his, but somebody else. It seems as though 3 or 4 families went up together to Maine. And we don't know why, but one of their descendants is working on it. And John Quigley, who we talked about last time, he doesn't go far, but he leaves. Same time period, he goes up the Fall River. And remember the Gibbenses I showed you, one of the witnesses who ran one of the boarding houses? They end up in upstate New York. Okay, I did find some people. Yeah. Jeffrey O'Reilly, William Mansfield, he gave testimony and he actually left the boarding houses and ended up in Newport. Cottrell, according to his obituary, worked at the fort. And Roger McCormick, you got to put a little question mark next to his name because I don't think he ever worked at Fort Adams. His son was an apprentice at Fort Adams. Okay, I think Roger McCormick never even lived out there. Okay, he lived in town right from the get-go, but he ends up in Newport. And so if the evidence doesn't fit the narrative, what do? Well, some people just change the evidence. But I decided, okay, this is where that last document comes in, right here. And it yields 58 names of individuals who were here in 1844. And what they were doing here is they were having a meeting. It was a political meeting to raise money for an issue. And it wasn't a political issue in Newport. And it wasn't a political issue in Rhode Island. And it wasn't even a political issue in the United States. It was a political issue in Ireland. And what they were raising money for is they wanted the British Parliament to repeal the Act of Union that made Ireland part of Great Britain. Okay? And it was run by a guy named Daniel O'Connell. There's been books written about this, and we aren't going to go into it that much tonight. But all over Great Britain, Daniel O'Connell held these meetings to raise money to repeal the Act of Union. And everywhere there was an Irishman in the whole world, or an Irish community, they had these meetings. Newport had two of them. One in 1843, and the one you're sitting on, probably, if you look at it, that's the one from the Boston Pilot that lists the names, 1844. So this is the way the 1843 one was announced in the Newport Mercury. There will be a meeting of the Friends of Irish Repeal at the Town Hall this evening at 7:30. Mr. McGee of Boston will be present. And then check this out. What? 1843? That's like 80 years before women got the right to vote? What is up with that? And I think there's a simple answer to this. The women were working and they had money. And if they could contribute to the cause, they were welcome. And if you look at what I gave you, there were a lot of women. All the people in red are the women who were there. And some of them, two of them, Mrs. Susan Coe and Mrs. Gorman, but the rest of them are independent, single. Well, we don't know if they're single or not. We know Joanna Quirk was single. She was the maid of honor at John Quigley's wedding in the church on Barney Street. She stays single her whole life. She's invited to this, and she gives money. These are the folks, and when you really look at these folks, we can find them in Pat Murphy's list. These guys are buried at St. Mary's. These folks you can find in the 1856 city directory. These guys you can find in the census. These guys, these folks, you can find their descendants, a lot of them in town. The McCormicks, Thomas Roach was the treasurer. Edward McHugh was the only person on this list who could vote. He owned enough property to vote. He had to own property to vote. He was the only one. And by the way, I just did calculations. If you gave $1, you see this? If you look at your list, there are a lot of people who gave $1. If you gave $1, that's like $75 today. If you gave $2, that's $150. So these folks, especially the ones who gave some money, okay, had some money. We know that. So how does this help us with our narrative? It seems that all of these people, and when you get down and dirty and you start doing the research about when these guys arrived, you'll find out that they arrived after 1835. And when they get to Newport, they come here because there's a church, and there's a cemetery, and there's a priest, and there's a pretty good reputation for Irishmen here. And so when they get here, they look at the opportunities out at Fort Adams, they look at the mills and the hotels, and they decide to put their money on the hotels and the mills. And they stay in town. And they keep their families in town. And this is the second wave of immigration that comes. I think, and this is my working thesis right now, the first wave of Newport Irish that come to build the fort, most of them, if not a majority of them, leave. They're followed by immigrants who come like chain migration. We hear a lot about that today. They come after 1835 and they stay in town. And they're the ones that build on the foundation of those folks, the Fort Adams Irish. Right? Now, 2 years ago, I was sitting out there with you, probably hiding in the back with those guys. And I was listening to Professor Kurt Chipley from Fairfield University. And I saw his maps. I told you I was a map geek, right? I saw his maps, and I went, wow, that is really impressive. So this is Steve Marino's version of that. Okay? I took the 1840 dwelling survey in my spreadsheet, and I wanted to figure out where the Irish lived in 1840. This nascent Irish community in town. Now, I had to work a little magic because I'm telling an 1840s story with an 1850s map. So I had to do some fooling around. First, I had to get rid of the Bellevue Hotel. So I made that disappear. You see it up here? There it goes. It's moving. Then the Atlantic Hotel, that wasn't there in 1840, so I had to get rid of that. All right. And then St. Mary's. St. Mary's wasn't there. St. Mary's was just a glint in the eye of the bishop in 1840. So I got to go to St. Mary's. Okay. Now, let's see if I can do this. I got some crib sheets here. The first guy is William Mansfield, and he leaves the boarding house, and he settles on West Street, next to his neighbor, John Ring. Jefferson O'Reilly, he prefers to live near the church, on Barney Street in Spring. And I think the reason he and his wife, Anne, wanted to live closer to the church, because their infant daughter was buried in the cemetery. The very first gravestone over at the Barney Street Cemetery is their daughter. And then we have Jeremiah Murphy. He's stuck out at Bannister's Wharf. And Bannister's Wharf was nothing like it is today. The McCormicks lived on Holland Street, in the southern part of town, near the Coddington Mill. And they maintained a residence there for a good 70 years. Okay, the McCormicks on Holland Street. The Hickeys live on Levin Street, which is now Memorial Boulevard. The Devines live on William Street, around the corner. The Cunninghams live on Denison Street, down by the Woolen Mill. The Cottrells live on Levin Street. The Callahans live on West Pelham, over with Murphy. And then what I did is I scoured the 1840 dwelling survey, and there weren't a lot of Irishmen in Newport in 1840. There just weren't a lot of them. Most of them were still out at the fort. And that's where they go. Okay, a lot more out of Bannister's Wharf, Long Wharf, and then Denison Street, Levin, William, Thomas Street, and a few up the hill on Perry and Pope and West Street. And then what I did is I took the Repealers, right? And I got the Repealers and I said, where did they live? Now the Repealers had some money, right? None of them lived out on the wharf. Not one. This is where the Repealers live. Let's see if I can do this. And they basically go where the Irishmen are. All right? A lot more up on the hill, a lot more on Denison Street, more out on the wharfs as well. And then there's a big cluster right here. Well, this is 1840. This is 1840. So what does this all mean? Oh, I wanted to add one more person. Came from Ireland. That's Ireland up there in the corner. And that's Thomas Galvin, his name was. And Thomas Galvin, if you look at your list, he gave $1 at the repeal meeting. He came over in 1842. He's a classic example of who we're talking about. In 1842, you couldn't live at the fort, and the employment opportunities weren't that hot. So Galvin comes to town. He had some money in his pocket. He gives $1 at the repeal meeting, and the next year, 1845, he opens up Galvin's Gardens on Dearborn Street. And if you're familiar with this house is still there. And now this is not what it looked like in 1845. Okay, but this is in 1888. But the reason I wanted to show you that is because a lot of the Irishmen worked in the mills. And a lot of the Irishmen work in the tourist industry, but there are a lot of Irishmen who set up their own businesses early. And Galvin is a perfect example of that. So what does this all mean? Well, I hope what you take away from this is that the Irish community in 1836 was the Fort Adams Irish. They were apart, they were over there, and they were pretty much unsupervised. The Irish in 1846, totally different ballgame. Okay? They were in town, they were integrated, and they were working in Newport. And I got to thank my wife for this. Take a look at this. I think this might be a coincidence, so I'm not going to make a big deal about it. In this list, there are 10 men and 1 woman. In this list, there are 3 men and 3 women. Okay, it kind of supports our theory about the difference between that community and this community. Okay. If you'll indulge me, I just want to do one more document. The one that's you saw when you walked in. It's on the front page of this. The first St. Patrick's Day parade in Newport history. 1842. After a discourse from Reverend Mr. O'Reilly at the Catholic chapel, they formed a procession, and with a band of music, marched through the principal streets. After which, the members of the society and several invited guests sat down to entertainment at the Masonic Hall. I don't think there's a coincidence that this was in 1842. I think these folks were making a statement. And the statement was really clear. The era of the Fort Adams Irish, out there, apart, and the other, is over. But the Irish aren't going away. We're going to be in Newport, we're going to be part of the community, and we're going to make some noise, and we're going to march through the principal streets. We're not going away, just because that's over. And really, I think what happened this month and what happened this week in Newport is a tribute and a testament to these folks. We're going to stay, we're going to make a little noise, and we're going to be part of this community. And you got to indulge me, this is just my fantasy. Okay? I think the parade went something like this. They started right there. That's St. Joseph's Church in Barney Street. That's where they started. And then they marched up Mount Vernon and down Bull. Because what's a parade if you don't go down Broad Street, right? Broadway, right? And so they went down Broadway, past, there it is. You get to see it. Down to the Customs House. Took a left on Thames, probably to Pelham. Went up Pelham to the old stone mill, took a right, took a left, onto South Truro Street. Bellevue Avenue didn't exist yet. And then they went down Church to the Masonic Hall. And then they had an entertainment. Now thank God for the Boston Pilot, because the Boston Pilot did a little article on this. As was the custom of the day, when you had an entertainment, that meant you toasted. Yes. Jefferson O'Reilly gave a toast, right? Thomas Galvin gave a toast. William Mansfield, the Forrest Gump of our story, he gave a toast. And in the spirit of the day, I'm going to give a toast. Steve Marino's going to give a toast, all right? Until we meet again, may God hold you in the palm of his hand. Slán. It's almost 7 o'clock. He took too long. Okay. Did anybody have a question?
Questions? I will walk to the audience with this.
Yeah, give it to her. Because
What happened to Catherine?
she asked, what happened to Catherine? I can't find her, but I know what happened to the two guys. The charge of the judge, which occupied nearly 2 hours, was in favor of the prisoners, and the jury, after being out a few minutes, returned a verdict of not guilty. There's a lot more to this story. This is a fascinating case. It deserves somebody to write an article about it. It is unbelievable, but we're going to leave it at that. Any other questions?
Yes, what would the, in your estimation, what would the percent of Irish be in the population at that time?
Oh, I think I should know this. Professor Quinn definitely knows this. It's small. It's small. It's minuscule. I mean, there was a population of 8,000 people, and a few hundred were Irish. It's very. When I went through the dwelling survey, it makes it sound like a big deal, but there's not a lot of Irish names in there living in Newport in 1840. I wish I knew the number. I think I could probably tell. Anybody else have a question? Yes, sir.
You could probably hear me. What struck me as a product of the 1940s, 50s Catholic education was that the procession ended at the Masonic hall.
Yeah. Is that amazing?
Was there an ecumenical movement going on? I find
Shocked me. Shocked me. I can't. I'm speechless. Speechless.
everyone should be.
And that's why, by the way, I didn't think anybody would believe me if I didn't bring the article. I mean, yeah. Catholic meeting at the Masonic Hall. Yes,
I
ma'am.
bet you I know what it was.
Oh, yeah, they paid him to have the meeting. Yeah. Maybe. All right. Thank you very much for coming. And I'll be up here.
I just want to say one word here, and I think that was extraordinary. Steve joined the board 4 years ago, 5 years ago, I can't remember exactly. He started out by saying, I'm going to research Fort Adams, and I can't believe how little, it's almost nothing, has been written about it. So this was shoveling and digging and scratching and clawing to get that information. It's wonderful.
It was a labor of love. Thank you.
Thank you all.